I am now very pleased to introduce the moderator for our first plenary session of the conference, Dustin Garrick, who will lead a discussion on the rivers in the western U.S., a changing climate and the role of irrigated agriculture. Dustin is the University Research Chair in Water and Development Policy at the University of Waterloo and a Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. Dustin.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and thank you all. Good morning. I wanted to start by adding my thanks to Amber, to Francis, to Molly, to Nick and Peter, and all those who are involved in organizing this conference. It is a tremendous event, and I was here in 2019, so looking forward to reconnecting with many of you and many new faces as well. I sat over breakfast with someone who traveled over 60 hours to be here from India, and I realized what a wealth of knowledge and expertise we have around this room. And the purpose of this session, Focus in Western Rivers, is to anchor that in some of the lessons and expertise from people who have been working in California, Colorado River, places that are really ripped from the headlines, and providing unique perspective on many of the challenges that will be familiar to many of us around water scarcity and irrigation management. So just by way of brief background, as Peter mentioned, my name is Dustin Garrick. I'm a professor of water and development policy with a background trained as a geographer, focused in the economics and politics of water. And I did my PhD at the University of Arizona, working on water management issues across western US, Mexico, and their struggles to adapt to changing climate and changing pressures as urbanization and other competition for water intensified. And over the years since, I've really had the chance to travel the world and learn from other regions which are on the leading edge of challenges of water scarcity. And over this period, there tends to be a focus back on the Colorado River, where I had my start, and some of the issues that are being addressed as the region experiences aridification and some of the challenges of competition over dwindling water supplies. So in the rest of today's session, we're very fortunate to have a set of panelists and experts from the region, and what we want to do is three things. First, we want to learn from the leading edge. The Colorado River occupies something of a position as a canary in the coal mine, and that it's a preview for many of the issues that are relevant in other places of the world. When I finished my PhD, I was told, by the way, that it was the most overstudied problem in the world and it was hopeless. And in the 15, 16 years since, the US and Mexico have developed a binational agreement to restore flood pulses to the Delta. A number of incremental and important agreements have changed, and I think we should be grateful that, President Carter's bias to action is being heeded by so many of you. The second thing we want to do in today's session is to ground innovation in reality. I think it's worth recognizing that any innovation is solving a problem and born out of recognition that our solutions in the past may not be working as well as they need to anymore. So we need to be able to ground innovation in reality and to learn from failure as well as successes and the factors that will be necessary for them to scale. And finally, we want to address this and ground innovation in reality by surfacing and tackling the hard questions. It's time to get real and to bring up questions that will be addressing in the context of California and the Colorado River, but we hope to address throughout the different places and regions where many of you are working. And finally, we recognize in our panel that we only have a small subset of the expertise needed. Most of the insights are actually sitting in this room, and so we've wanted to structure the panel with brief presentation, which I'll introduce in a moment, followed by a panel and a fireside chat, a structured but informal conversation that's really meant to set the tone for inclusion and bringing in the questions and insights that you have in the audience. So how are we going to spend the rest of our time? First, we'll provide some context with some scene setting and a presentation by our first panelist, Felicia Marcus, who will give us an overview of California and the Colorado River really at the crossroads. And then I will invite the rest of our panel, Dick Wolf and Tom Eisman, to join us with perspective and insights from the work that they're doing across Colorado River in the West. So without further ado, let me take a moment to introduce Felicia, and then I'll turn it over to you for the presentation. So we noted before that brief introductions will be used, and that'll be necessary for Felicia. Felicia Marcus is an attorney who has served in positions across government, nonprofit, and the private sector, and she's currently serving as the Landreth Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Water in the West program. She's also a member of the Water Policy Group, an international network of current and high-level water officials spanning 6 continents that advise water policy. And I have to scroll down here, but I remember her most prized and privileged role is serving on the board for the Doherty Water for Food Institute, if I recall well. So she has a deep connection and commitment to these issues, and we'll get a chance to learn a little bit more from Felicia now. Over to you.
Good morning. As I wait for my PowerPoint to pop up, which is the other one. Hi. I'm both honored and humbled to be here, particularly humbled given the breadth and the range and the depth of expertise that I know is in this room, both from those of you that I know and I'm happy to know, and those I have yet to meet, and look forward to meeting you over the course of the next couple of days. I'm also honored to be a member of the Doherty Global Water for Food Institute board. It's really quite an honor to be part of this amazing endeavor. Whoops, there we go. I have a challenge today, and I'm going to try and go quickly through what is a very deep, layered, and complex set of issues, not to make you experts on the Colorado River, but to set the stage for the panel discussion that we have with my particularly insightful, experienced, and cool panel. I already feel like we have a little pod going with this group with just a little bit of preparation here. What I'm hoping to do is just give you a framework in some ways for the conversation, but also for those of you who have been following in the news, maybe a little clarity on what you've been reading about with the Colorado River, because it is the river that has been in the news across the country over the past year, and it will be in the news over the next 6 months. So hopefully I'll give you enough insight that you will have a little more understanding of what you're going to be reading and seeing, and hopefully I'll also set the stage for an interesting conversation with my peers. Sorry, if I can figure out this button, the big one on the top. Let's see, wait. So here we go. This is, again, just setting the stage, very obvious for a lot of you, and it has a focus on California because that's just the slide I always use, but this is sort of the famous Mike Dettinger bubble chart that basically shows how variable the hydrology is, particularly in the West, but even more so in California. And what that means is that it's not as predictable as it is in other parts of the world. People in California, friends of mine who haven't been out of California, are surprised it actually rains in the summer places. And in fact, the fact that it's still raining in California in May is a topic of conversation. It was in April as well. So we are a classic Mediterranean climate. It doesn't tend to rain in the summer, and that leads to certain issues. And as you can see, looking at the famous 100th meridian chart, although the meridian seems to be moving, you're acutely aware of it in Nebraska because you straddle it in a way that's absolutely fascinating. It's a microcosm of the entire nation in some ways. You do have the West that faces more dryness and therefore more irrigation and the like, although that's changing across the country. But this is a defining characteristic of life in this part of the world. In the West, in particular, in the Southwest, we've been facing what's been termed a megadrought. You could say it's the worst in 1,200 years. There's always a metric that comes up that you can find different ones, so you pick whichever one you like. Whichever one you like, it's a whammy. And if you're in California, we either are in the second worst drought in modern history within a decade, or we're in a decadal drought that's been punctuated by a couple of wet years, this past year notwithstanding. And I was at the State Water Board during our last drought, which was the worst in 500 years, the worst in 1,200 years, and then it was broken by record rains, which have been totally eclipsed in this past year. The Colorado River, on the other hand, I'll show you some more pictures later, has actually been in a 23-year drought. But that drought's been masked in terms of its impact on a lot of places in the West, but particularly Arizona, Nevada, and California, by the presence of the two largest dams in the US, which are possible on the Colorado, which spans 7 states, because of its geology and geography and the fact that Lake Powell and Lake Mead are there, which have bailed out places like Arizona and Southern California over the course of the droughts that they have on their other rivers. And I'll show you a picture in a minute about that. Those reservoirs are now near dead pool. They're at the lowest place they've been since the reservoirs were filled decades ago. Climate change is going to be a game changer here, making this sort of a thing, which of course has happened in past history. We've had 40 and 400-year droughts if you look at tree rings and lake bottom cores. They've been there, but the last 100+ years or so, we've had a more or less wet era compared to those eras, and so we've lived in a period where, at least in California, with our Sierra system, which again I'll show you in a moment, has a bunch of short rivers along the Sierras, we've come to an illusion that we have a 3 to 4 year drought cycle, when in fact we've had 40 and 400-year droughts. Australia, same thing, same 100+ years of recording of the hydrology, relatively wet period where they had a 3 to 4 year drought cycle, and then they got hit with their millennial drought in the middle of the 90s, which we watched and we saw, and we tried to act more quickly than we would have otherwise in the last drought in California, but clearly not quickly enough collectively. Let me move on to the next one just to keep us moving. Here's just to give you a sense of the 7 states, 2 countries, 10 or 30 tribes, depending on how you count it, 10 on the main stem and 30 on a bunch of the tributaries. This is an active discussion between and among the tribes, but it's kind of a big deal when you look at it. At the time the Colorado River Compact was set up, I don't know, 100 years ago, whatever it is, there was an assumption that we'd see an average of 15 million acre-feet a year. Well, no surprise, as with most projects, certainly all the projects in California as well, we haven't seen that. It was overly optimistic, and they split it 7.5, 7.5 among the upper basin states and the lower basin states, with the lower basin states having utilized and actually overutilized it and having to cut back in the 90s to live within their means. And Dick will be able to talk a little bit more if we get to it about the difference in views between the upper and the lower basin on what the equities are here. But this is a lot of players to coordinate in coming to agreements, and they have, and you see all these states, tribes, and Mexico. Tribes have significant rights. I'm sorry about the quality here. You see the tribes scattered throughout the 7-state region. I feel like I'm missing a state if I count, but I won't. No, I've got them. The picture has bad clarity. There's bad clarity in how this issue has been resolved over the years. I will say, from having worked on it over the years, starting in the 90s, I think, when I was at US EPA working with Interior a lot and working with tribes within my region, we've made a lot of progress in the last 3 decades on tribal settlements. That is settlements and resolution of agreements that were reached over 100 years ago in their treaties that have never been implemented. So you have far more tribes engaged and having access, in theory, to their water, but of course they don't always have the infrastructure they need, and settlements between the federal government, the states, and the tribes have frequently led to them getting the initial infrastructure they need to even take advantage of their rights to have enough water to support the homelands. So there's a long historical challenge here, and there is an issue out there about how involved the states are in the current negotiations about where we go from here, let alone the interim agreements which have been reached. And I agree with Dustin. I think the interim agreements are worthy of praise, and some of them are very creative, but the fact remains that we are reaching dead pool with all kinds of implications for water and for the 40 million is the estimate people who rely on that water for something or other, whatever it is, whether it's agriculture, urban development, or other ecological and sustainability needs. So it's an amazing challenge, and one where the tribes need to be involved, and being involved more and more in the dialogue, but not so much in the big negotiation. So you'll hear about that as well as you read the papers. Here's getting to the one, I didn't want to over-Californicate my presentation. I sort of probably, because I talk about California so much, I probably put too little in, but this is the nightmare that we all face of climate change. That variable hydrology only sustains the population and the agricultural and urban development of large parts of the Southwest in California, and the rest because of a massive system of infrastructure, both these reservoirs and canals. And that's because we need storage in order to make it work, because we use the water at different places, different times. It has to last multiple years from where it falls. But our biggest reservoir by far is our snowpack, by far, because it melts out in the time that it's needed generally, but it also melts out and refills those reservoirs, replenishes the streams, refills slowly at a pace that can be absorbed our groundwater basins. And with just a few degrees temperature rise Fahrenheit, we lose it. We get more flooding in the spring, which is what we're about to see, even though we have a bountiful snowpack. But imagine if all of that, it had been a warm series of storms that hit California. Someone said 30 atmospheric rivers. I was counting about 14 or 15, unprecedented in that modern recorded history, not unprecedented in history. But it all hits. We have more flooding in the spring and more scarcity in the growing season and in the times when water's most used. So this is the nightmare facing us all that we know, and of course it also leads to forest fires, et cetera, wildfires, which have implications not only for air quality and climate, but for water quality and the like. So a big issue for all of us, staring us in the face. And the same is true of the Rockies, even though it's not as picturesque, but it's just as dramatic in real life. And as much as everybody's seen I call it a snowpack-a-palooza, but it's harder to say than to type on your screen. It's more dramatic in California, at some places being at 300% of average. Nonetheless, it is above average and welcome and glorious, but it's not going to be enough to bail us out, and I think we'll talk about that in a minute. So here are just some, forgive me, late night Googling for pictures, elements to bear in mind. We are at this tail end of a 23-year drought that we don't know when it's going to end, and we have this amazing snowpack refresh. That just buys us a little of emotional time, a little bit of time to plan. People estimate that only adds 6 months to a year to the time we have before Deadpool. I've already talked about some of this. The drought's definitely not over. It's going to take a parade of these years. If we had years like this every year, it takes 6 to get us back to where I think people could sleep well at night along the Colorado. They're very different perspectives and views of even facts and history among the various states and tribes, and we can get into that, and the nations as well. It is governed by a law of the river, largely based on first in time, first in right, but with other agreements overlaid. So it's a particularly complex river, but law of the river does include a seniority, which is why the Imperial Irrigation District at the very tail end in California is the most senior and has the largest chunk of the river, something that bothers everyone up the rest of the river, but that's the way first in time, first in right works. And again, there have been interim agreements that have delayed this day, which is great. But key to see as you read the headlines, and this is where I think they get them wrong a lot of the time, the politics of this are very difficult. You can castigate the leaders of the 7 states and the water agencies for not having fixed this, but it is very difficult. And there are a lot of reasons in that, but I will pick maybe 1 or 2. One is, having been through a lot of negotiations on water issues in California, but also between the US and Mexico in my various jobs, a political leader can't give water away. They can lose it in a negotiation. They can point to the big bad meanie feds, which will be my next slide, as a reason why they had to give up water. But they can't just give it away. everybody's afraid of being a chump. Everybody's afraid of not being elected the next time. But more importantly, they're afraid of letting their people down. And so there's a dance that happens through all of this. And so what you may read in the headlines frequently has been a punchline that isn't accurate about what's actually been happening out there, and we can talk about that a bit if people are interested. I'm also happy to give you my phone number. You can ask me when you read a headline and see whether it makes sense or not. But there's something very grand, and there's a grand dance going on, and let me explain a little bit about what's going on. Because the 7 states who had reached these interim agreements, which have forestalled this day for a good, 6 or 7 years, people estimate, but they can't anymore. They've sort of reached the end of the line. The federal government, who manages the river, the Bureau of Reclamation, has said, you guys have to make a deal or we're going to impose something. And what they threaten in imposing something is to go outside of the existing agreements, because the existing agreements clearly don't work. They're drawing more water down than the system can bear. So their threat is that they will take action in the absence of a 7-state agreement. So the last thing that happened, I won't go through all of the things that have happened, the last thing they asked for was a series of modeling runs from the states to know what to model in an environmental impact statement that they have to do before they can make this big of a decision. And they've signaled that they are willing to not just look at the law of the river and use some other tools that are in the agreements, in their federal legislation enabling statutes, where they can take a look at what are beneficial uses. I won't get into a whole water rights lecture here, but that does indicate that they can make a decision that a certain kind of use isn't beneficial and that they don't need to support. In California, we have a more robust history of doing this. It's a part of our Constitution. It's pretty unheralded or unprecedented on the Colorado River, although they did threaten to do it to Imperial back in the 90s, which was part of what became a big agreement to get California to live within its 4.4 million acre feet allocation. So they asked for modeling runs, and what you saw in the headlines was a 6-state consensus proposal, which came up with, I'll call it novel. It seems like it makes sense. It's actually in use in the upper basin, but that they would count evaporative losses against the lower basin states. And obviously with big reservoirs and canals, you have a lot of evaporative losses. That would have put the burden on California and Arizona, but California most of all in terms of taking a hit on the 2 to 4 million acre feet that they said we needed to cut. That's a lot. That's like a 25% cut or more on use, which is enormous if you think about that in terms of agriculture and urban. And agriculture, I think in the Colorado Basin is more of a 70-30 split. I think that's what I've read. All over the world, it's 70 or 80% ag to urban. But again, just my little editorial I always had to make in California, if you count in the urban footprint the food they eat, that ends up totally changing the dynamic. The urban footprint isn't just your lawn and your trees and your showers and your washing machine. It's also the food you eat that you get from agriculture, which in this audience is obvious. I guarantee you it's not obvious to those people who think it doesn't rain in the summer anywhere. So it ends up being an important dynamic. So they put in that modeling run, which they called the consensus approach, of course 6 of 7. The headlines all read that California was a holdout, like they were being a bunch of big jerks. But California is the most senior. And the seniority system, which almost anyone in water rights in the West pledges allegiance to, it seems to me, every morning, except when it comes to this issue. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of the dynamic between the states and really tough rhetoric among the states, which was surprising considering the fact that they had done so many agreements. The good news is that what's happened since is a little encouraging. There's $4 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act that the Interior can use to ease this transition. They've issued some to protect the Salton Sea, which is very important because you can't ask Imperial to give up water if it means the lake is going to dry up faster and end up poisoning the air of their own community. So that was an exciting thing. They've put out some money for temporary fallowing, and we're waiting on a big chunk, which I'm hoping will be a mix of both fallowing lawns and perhaps fallowing fields from willing sellers. So obviously big issues there to watch. But they came out with an April draft environmental impact statement, which people seem to miss. Instead of asking for 4 million acre-feet of cuts. It's asking for 2, a little over 2, which means the rains did play a role in what they had to see, what they had to say, and it came out with 2 alternatives, not 2 alternative choices, as the media said, but 2 alternative bookends, which Interior explained but never got picked up in the media, that they could study that would allow them to make a choice in between. One of which follows the law of the river and priority heavily, which really hammers Arizona tremendously because they're junior by agreement and complicated series of agreements in addition to having been developed a little bit later. And another one that spreads the cuts equally across the lower basin states, which would hurt California the most. And my guess is they'll end up somewhere in the middle. But the more important thing about that was that the statements from the states after that were completely different than the statements in the end of January. The fighting words were gone, and they were all saying, we think we can do this, and we can work this out somehow. So I'm just trying to give you the tone shift encouraging words. And so with that, let's get to the conversation. I'm just giving you a little sense of it, and I'll look forward to the conversation with my colleagues.
And I'll just invite the panel to take a seat on the yellow couch. I'll get the first question off here. Just to say thank you, Felicia. That was a lovely tour de force through California and the Colorado River. And I was checking Dick's blood pressure next to me on the entire time to see whether this was in line with the Colorado's position on these issues. And he seemed pretty calm, actually. So wanted to build on that context. And many in the audience may be wondering why to start a conference like this and a conversation like this with lessons from the Colorado River. And I think we now see through Felicia's presentation that this is something of a microcosm or representation of many of the issues that are echoing throughout the world. And it's really important to have context when we're talking about innovation and working through these issues. I wanted to bring in and invite the rest of our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Dick Wolf, who is bringing his perspective currently with LRE Water and formerly with the hat as State Engineer and Director for the Colorado Division of Water Resources to this issue. And I wanted to bring a question that we hear a lot in the Colorado River in the West, and I think many throughout the audience will be confronting as well, which is we hear a lot about the future of agriculture in the West and a lot arguing that it needs to shrink. Does it need to shrink? With your multiple hats, both through your experience as a state engineer and also I understand your own family's experience in farming, tell us your perspective on how to right-size farming across the West.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Great question, Dustin, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here on the panel today. And for me, it's a given that it will shrink, and it's just a matter of how much. And your question, when you raised this, reminded me of a bumper sticker back in about 20 years ago after 2002 drought, which was a historic drought in Colorado and throughout the West. And on the bumper sticker, it said, "The future of ag in Colorado, chili." And I don't raise that, just that point statement suggests that that's going to be the future of ag in Colorado in the future, but to make the point that every problem has a solution, and although it may not be the outcome that was originally hoped for or expected. So if we want to have an influence on the future size of agriculture, we're going to need to be proactive. And I know a lot of you in this room here today are in that role of being proactive, but we oftentimes are generally tend to be reactive to situations instead of being proactive. We tend to oftentimes act when we're in a crisis mode. And so what I wanted to do is talk about, let's think about some of the factors that's pushing us in the direction of shrinking farming, in particular irrigated farming. We've spent the past 150 plus years developing the water resources in the West, particularly or primarily for irrigation. And now we're essentially working with a developed resource that is predicted to decline in the future in much of the western U.S. Thus, we're in a phase of changing water from old uses like irrigation to new uses to meet future population demands. And agriculture is still a largest target for future water supplies to meet domestic water demands. And this seems natural because 80% or more of the water is used in agriculture, and it has some of the most senior water rights. So this is certainly an ideal source for municipalities to go after. And groundwater use in many areas is not sustainable due to the quantity, quality, or just the economics. So this puts additional pressure on the renewable surface water supplies as well. And in Colorado, water rights are private property rights that can be sold separately from the land. And even under Colorado's water plan, agriculture, they want to value it and they want to protect it as best they can. But the reality is many farmers are going to sell their water rights to the cities for future development. Since this is their retirement plan, many of the families, we have family farmers still on it too, and we're in this situation that there's nobody that wants to carry on that farming operation, so that's oftentimes their choice is then just to sell their land and the water rights that go with it. And municipalities plan for future water supplies to meet these demands many decades out. So consequently, they continue to buy and hold water rights, oftentimes quietly behind the scenes. Additionally, there's a lot of activity by private equity groups buying water rights and land. And their short-term goals may still be to irrigate, but their long-term goals are going to be to sell these water rights to municipal water providers. And even ditch companies, believe it or not, are now buying water rights for their retirement portfolios for their employees instead of traditional equities in the stock market. In Colorado, there's been many great collaborative water sharing agreements between farmers and cities, and I've been involved with many of them over my career. However, these just represent a small fraction of the overall water supply portfolios. And that's because municipalities like certainty and they like permanency. They don't tend to like to rely on these temporary plans, even though they're part of their portfolios. So these are going to be continuing to be driving factors and forces on agriculture. And unless we're proactive to look for alternative water supplies or ways to reduce the demand on the existing diminishing supplies, they will continue to be challenges for us. So thank you.
Thank you. Before we turn over to you, Tom, I just wanted to have a follow-up question really for you, Felicia, or anyone on the panel who wanted to jump in on this. One of the things to mention is that we talked about this session as a fireside chat, right? The term comes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then apparently this was started in 1933, so just about 90 years ago. And by the time it got to 1936, the topic was on drought in agriculture. And President Roosevelt's observation at the time was, you can't talk about drought unless we're also talking about employment and rural futures. The two issues are hand in hand. So in the context of what you're sharing with us, Dick, I wonder if anyone else on the panel wants to add a little bit more about what are the other conversations that need to be happening in parallel with discussions with farmers about participating in fallowing programs and these other kinds of initiatives. So back over to you, or Felicia, if you wanted to jump in on that.
No, I just say, I think all of this requires a greater sophistication about not siloing our thinking about just water. There are people who are in this field who only think about acre feet of water or gallons or million gallons a day, depending on what your unit of measure is. But I think we need a more sophisticated sense of what holds communities together. And I think that's where, at least the tensions over the ag-urban transfers seem much higher at the moment in Colorado and Arizona in particular. I'm not entirely sure why. That would be an interesting question than they are in California, although they do come up. But the fear in all the transfers is a fact that it's not just the individual farmer. It's if collectively you can lose a whole community and everybody who relies on it. And some of the rules on transfers, for example, even just transfers, temporary transfers in California, involve a very long evaluation of third-party impacts and the like. But getting to it, again, it's beneath the headlines, is part of where the real concerns are. And a lot of the opposition, I think, I'd be curious what Dick thinks, to even the first transfer, any kind of a transfer, has to do with camel's nose under the tent, that people see that any transfer, even if it's willing or wanted by the farmer for being able to leave something for their families, etc., and the very real challenge that their family doesn't necessarily want to keep farming, can be held back by this community fear. And so I think we need to realistically think about what to do. In California, we're trying to do a land repurposing program which has people collectively in communities, environmental communities, et cetera, trying to find alternatives, whether it's solar or different kind of crops, or paying Farmer Joe to farm water molecules for groundwater recharge. But it's in its infancy, at least in California, maybe further along in other places.
Thank you.
I'll just quickly add to that. And as Felicia's pointed out, in Colorado, the process to change a water right over from its historical purposes like agricultural irrigation to municipal use is a complex process. We have a water court system. And so the cost for that transaction, not only for the applicant who's transferring that, is expensive and time consuming, but it puts the burden on those remaining senior water right holders who are agriculturalists, who oftentimes have very slim margins of profits to operate, have to oftentimes spend many thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars defending their water rights to ensure that that transfer of that right does not impact them. And so that's where a lot of this tension comes about, putting those agricultural users in that oftentimes multiple times as these transfers occur.
Thank you so much for the great follow-up there. And I have to admit that last night, to help me get to bed, I listened to the 1936 Fireside Chat. It's so soothing and great, gives language about this interdependency that you're talking about, how farms and communities are connected with cities. The water we eat in the cities comes from the farm, and how we need to look at that community level transition there. And it's a really great segue to hear from Tom and introduce Tom Eisman, Director of Water Scarcity and Markets for the Global Freshwater Program at the Nature Conservancy, and a long-time collaborator. And I wanted to bring you into the conversation, Tom, by noting that TNC, Nature Conservancy, and a lot of local organizations are concerned about nature being missed in these discussions. And with shrinking water supplies, do you see there being room for the environment at the table? What do you think are the pathways and partnerships needed to bring the environment in?
Right. Well, thanks, Dustin. I think that's true as a starting point. On behalf of the Nature Conservancy, there's a concern that nature has been neglected in a lot of ways as we've developed our water resources. And it was talked about by our prior speakers, the fact that we were trying to promote development of the West, support agriculture and food production, and really allocate and maximize the use of the resource. And in that process, we may have overlooked nature. The Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization. Our mission is to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. We work in all 50 states. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, but we work in all 50 states, as well as 80 countries. And you know, what I would say is, as we've talked about, as Felicia has set the stage here, one of the things that we see is that we've come, I think, to a juncture where we've recognized that we have fully developed the resource and in many ways overdeveloped the resource. There are pressures to think about how do we reallocate and make the resource more sustainable over time. And just as a starting point, I think that process of rebalancing water use provides an opportunity for nature, that we're making the use of the resource more sustainable over time. We hope that ends up leaving more water in rivers and aquifers, and that we think more about the long-term trajectory of our water management and how to make it sustainable. And that includes the protection of these natural resources, the aquifers and rivers that provide the water supply. But I think more specifically, we see an opportunity for nature to be a part of the solution. And just, Felicia showed the snowpack as really the starting point of the fundamental resource that provides the water, the key reservoir for our water. And thinking more about the snowpack, our watersheds, riparian wetlands, wet meadows, and aquifers and the role that they play and can play as a part of the solution. As we protect those resources, make sure our forested watersheds are healthy, restore wetlands, that's an opportunity to bring nature into the equation as part of the solution to the challenges that we're discussing. But even more specifically, the Nature Conservancy is doing a lot of work on nature-based solutions in agriculture. What are the practices that we can put in place so we don't just end up shifting out of agriculture? I know there's a lot of pressure to shift water from agriculture, but what are the ways that we can make agriculture more efficient and resilient to these conditions? And the use of nature-based solutions, regenerative agriculture, different tilling practices, crop switching, and diversification, those are ways, as well as irrigation practices and water management, ways that we can stretch the water resource and use nature as a part of the solution to the challenges that we're facing. Dustin, partnerships are definitely needed. I think in a lot of ways we've described this challenge, and we've seen a lot of the work from the states and the federal agencies. We've talked about the tribes. NGOs like the Nature Conservancy are also a part of this discussion. We've had a program in the Colorado River Basin for about 20 years. It does take a lot of time, and we don't have the same voice, I would say, in a lot of these conversations, but we are a part of these discussions, and we're always looking for ways to contribute to these solutions. And there are many other partners who need to be a part of this. I think to the question of how do we make it sustainable over time, one of the things that we're always looking at is how do you fund or finance some of these nature-based solutions and make them sustainable and see what the return is on these investments. And for that, we're doing a lot of work with corporations, and I'll put in a quick plug here for a session in the next part of the agenda. Hannah Berger of the Nature Conservancy is hosting a session with Cargill on some of the ways that we will look to prioritize watershed investments and to help build resilience in their supply chains. And so that's one example of how do we try to make these sustainable over time as we build a way to invest in these practices for the future. So I'll pause there, Dustin. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Tom. And I think you introduced a number of partners and voices who will be important to first understanding these challenges and committing to the solutions, including the financing solutions. I wanted to mention for those in the audience, so far you've had the coffee, you're settling in, the jet lag is hitting, but we actually need you for this next section. And I'm going to have one more question for the panel while I'm asking you all to gather your own. But I would like to invite questions from the audience, including challenges, things that you're expecting to hear that you're not hearing, or issues that you're experiencing in your region that you'd like some perspective on, we can learn from the Colorado River in the West. And I understand, I'm looking a little bit over from Molly in a moment, that you can also submit these questions online somehow. So I'm sure that there's an app for that. And there's mics that I see standing right in the middle, so if you've got questions, you can line up at the mic so we'll know to call for you. And while we're collecting those questions, I've got one more to turn back to the panel. So we heard from Peter earlier about the need for solutions, for win-wins, for making progress. We've heard from a number of you about partnerships and interdependencies between the different water user groups, different states, the tribes, and other governments involved in these decisions, but we also know that the problem is severe and progress has not been keeping pace to date. So the question really is, what will it take to move beyond incremental change when we're talking about the difficult transitions for agriculture and the economies and communities in which they're embedded? So anyone want to volunteer to kick us off?
What would it take to get beyond incremental change? Well, prior to working for the Nature Conservancy, I was a Fed, and I worked at the Department of the Interior and with the Bureau of Reclamation that oversees a lot of these facilities in the Colorado River. And I agree completely, the politics were so hard, and Felicia addressed that well. But one of the other challenges I would say, looking back, that I hadn't appreciated at the time, but that was the uncertainty or the variability. And so even when I was at Interior, it was about 5 years ago that I left, we hadn't anticipated how severe the crisis would get. And that's hard to say because we were in the midst of this extended drought, but it's gotten even worse than we expected. And then you have a year like this when you have, a snowpack-a-palooza. So I can use that term, the technical term for a big snowpack year. And so that kind of changes the perspective on kind of the urgency of the solutions. And I think that variability is a hard challenge to deal with. And I do feel like this is a juncture when we're
Tom,
seeing...
do you mind if I interrupt you on that? I mean,
Yeah,
just on the issue of snowpack-a-palooza, I just wanted to see if I can say it. But also to get a sense for, whether people in your shoes were lamenting the fact that we had a good snowpack, because there was that crisis and window of opportunity. Do you sense that was a missed opportunity? Do you wish that we had one more dry year to get a little bit more progress done?
I actually think, I guess that was going to be my point, is I feel like the urgency is there still.
It is there.
And even with I think it does change the conversation in a sense, but I think the recognition, the investment, the negotiations that Felicia described, we're at this juncture where I think we'll get past incremental change, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. In one level, it's great to have the wonderful snowpack and the available water supply to help replenish the reservoirs. But it does it's a thing as humans, we tend to think, oh, that takes a little bit of the pressure off. You see that in the headlines. I think that's a little bit unfortunate. I think we need to continue to stay on task, be proactive. We need to have this earlier coordination and cooperation with water users. Just because, we tend to, as I indicated, we get into a reactionary mode. We wait till we're in a crisis till we do something. Oftentimes, as Felicia pointed out, it becomes political. We end up in litigation. And that oftentimes just results in small incremental change. But if we, I think, work together more proactively together amongst all these user groups and stakeholders, I think we can seek bigger change. There's no silver bullet out there. There's a lot of silver buckshot, though. There's a lot of things happening at all the local levels, and I think we need to continue to do that. And we talk about collaboration a lot, and sometimes that's an overused term, but when you're working in this developed resource, you do need to collaborate, and it does take a lot of work. I don't think it's just coincidence that the word labor is in the word collaboration, because it does take a lot of work, and so all of you play an important role in that, and working at the local level and state and federal levels to keep that moving in the right direction.
I like that a lot.
I do too. I never noticed that
collaboration.
That was good. Well, a few thoughts. One is, I knew I was going long, so I didn't tell my punchline, which I always do, about what happens next. We're going to have a lab to see if we can do this, because the decision I was talking about with the EIS is going to happen this July or August, and it's only for a few years. It's an interim thing, that 2 million acre foot cut I was talking about. 2026, we can redo the whole agreement. It's enormous, and so we have to figure out how to get it together to think differently. So we're going to have an opportunity to see how far people can reach to make the dramatic changes that need to be made. As you were talking about, I thought there were two things we needed. I'm going to echo my colleagues. I do think it's about people and about collaboration, to be sure. I'm fond of saying that the biggest challenge to solving any of these issues isn't legal, engineering, conservation, economics, no matter what your siloed profession is, it's not that, or even politics. It's the challenge of ecosystem management, not ecosystem management, which is not dealing with big egos, though we certainly deal with those in any field, but about recognizing the people in the particular constellation of that discussion. And I have some optimism because of the nature of the players who are at the table and their seeming willingness to add other people to the conversation, whether tribes or environmental community, and their relationships with each other, which was why I was dismayed at the end of January when the fighting words all came out from people who had historically been able to make some agreements, and why I was so happy that the "we can do this" language came out then in April, because that's what makes all of the difference. And essentially, we need the professionals who really can see the issue to make it happen, rather devolving into the political dogfights. And I'll just say there are some encouraging signs quite outside of that. You have in Southern California, which is 30% dependent on imported water from the Colorado, 30% dependent on water imported from the Sierras, 40% on exercising their own groundwater basins and recycling. Actually better than Northern California or the Bay Area. Just I always have to make that point in that regard. You're seeing amazing on speed efforts at conservation, changing out lawns. The most massive recycled water projects in the world are in, one is done in Orange County, 2 are in production now, and you have a massive stormwater capture program, which is going to integrate nature-based solutions across the county of LA to the tune of $300 million a year in perpetuity. So people aren't sleeping. They're figuring out how to do some of this complex work that works across jurisdictional and organizational boundaries. So it's not nothing. In fact, the Metropolitan's recycle water project is 150 million gallons a day. They even have partnerships with Las Vegas and talking with Arizona about paying for that project so that they can take a little of the Colorado. So you're seeing grand partnerships start to form, and that's the kind of thing we need to do in order to reach. It's much harder than what we've done, and we have to do it all faster. It's also the same thing with the nature-based solutions, where you're working across disciplines and working from the top of the headwaters in the forest, through meadow restoration, through agricultural practices. If we do all of those, and we cut back on water significantly, we can make it work. But it's a big if, and that if really depends on people.
That's great. And speaking of which, I noticed that we have a queue at the back with some questions. So I see at least 2. I'll encourage you to ask brief questions and for the panelists to be concise in the answers so that we can bring as many people into the conversation. And I think we'll field 2 questions at the same time, so we'll rate to respond. Into the back then.
I'm glad you guys have got it all figured out, but appreciate it. Chris Clayton, I'm an agricultural journalist. I've been hearing a lot more criticism of what is being irrigated, that so much of the irrigation in the Colorado River is forage crops for livestock, forage crops for livestock that is being, forage crops being exported. How do you move to shift what farmers are actually growing without some sort of intense mandate or demand, which you're obviously not going to get from Congress or anything? How do you make that kind of shift in what farmers are producing? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. We'll take one more in the back there.
Oh, I'm not that tall. Hi, good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Nicole. I'm a PhD researcher. And my question is kind of a follow-up on that one. You've talked a lot about the challenges that we face and also actually the many solutions that we have to possibly address these. And I'd like to hear your, I suppose, vision or advice on what do you think we should prioritize for the next 5 years, because we do not have the resources to implement all of the solutions, right? So what can I, as a soon-to-graduate person, individual, focus on to help contribute? Thank you.
Great questions. So the cropping selection and priorities for the next 5 years, anyone want to volunteer to kick us off? Tom, I saw some knowing nods with the crop selection.
Yeah, I feel like Dick maybe should speak to this more than me, but it is, I was agreeing that I had seen the commentary on what's being grown in the Colorado River Basin and what are the uses or utility. You clearly cannot tell farmers what to grow. I agree with that. And certainly Congress is not going to do that. And so I think the question goes to then how can you work with farmers, though, to promote different or new practices, including potentially crop selection, that will be more sustainable and more, or at least equally valuable in terms of returns. And that is the way that we're approaching this challenge, is figuring out how to work with farmers to introduce some of these new practices in a way that helps to make the resource more sustainable. I hope that that's the kind of conversation that we're going to be having this week. I certainly don't think the Nature Conservancy has all the answers to this question. And I know there are a lot of people in this room with different perspectives, and I think we can have a good discussion about how best to have that conversation about looking at the agricultural practices and thinking about the transitions that need to be made, certainly without dictating changes or prescribing specific crops to be grown or not.
Maybe just to add to that a little bit, growing up on a farm, being raised on a farm, and still in the farming business, so much of our decisions and what we do year to year is based on what our past practices have been. We have the equipment to plant and harvest certain crops. There's a certain demand for our crops in the area, whether it's corn or hay for the local cattle and feedlots that are in the area. So there's so much of the local dynamics in the economy, local economy, that drive a lot of our decisions year to year and what we do. And there hasn't been any overarching incentives to try to change and go in that. Matter of fact, last year was the first time we tried planting sugar beets, and had a pretty good year in trying to do that, because there's not as much of that going on in our region now as it used to be 100 years ago. But so much of those day-to-day and year-to-year decisions are just embedded within that family culture, and so it's oftentimes hard to change that in any meaningful way.
Thank you.
Just a few observations. I do think this issue came in California during the last aspect of the drought in the teens. The villain wasn't so much forage crops as it was almonds. And people made a big deal about how an almond was a gallon a nut, as if that by itself made almonds the problem. Walnuts are 5. My beloved avocados can be 63 or 94, depending on the size. So I think it gets back to that issue of people not realizing the water content of their food. But the issue isn't the nut. The issue was the mass proliferation of planting permanent crops over overdrafted groundwater basins. And the answer isn't so much picking crops, because we don't have a planned economy, so it's difficult. Although in California, we do have the ability, and I kept waiting for a petition on this, but we did other things instead, and we never got the petition to say it was waste and unreasonable use to to blanket an overdrafted groundwater basin with permanent crops. And that might have gotten a finding within the California Constitution in a particular location, because there are places where you use almonds and pistachios to use less water and maintain the economic viability of a community. It's actually been a very good tool in some overdrafted groundwater basins for folks to be able to transfer from alfalfa to nuts, just not the same acreage, use less water, and gain the same economic value. So the answer is always it depends. And it depends on the locality and the issue, not blanket statements about things. The other issue I'll throw in is that, for example, in California, there was a big issue about nuts for export, same issue as the forage crop issue, and I said, someone needs to show me a record of how much water we import in our electronics and other things. Because it's not as simple as saying we're exporting our water, because we're also importing other things. And yet, we do have to do something. So there's a longer conversation to be had there. In respect to the next question, which is how we should prioritize, for me, it's been a lot of prioritization in the urban sector, which is very important to be more efficient in the agricultural sector as well, to be sure. But in the urban sector, where you can transition out of lawns, deal with leaks. I mean, lawns in some parts of California, it's true in other dry places, ornamental landscaping is over 50% of urban water use. And not all of it, but a big chunk of that is keeping your lawn as green as a Scottish golf course in the middle of the summer. That is not the most essential use of water. And actually, in many places, the house just came with the lawn. It's not even that important. It's a lot of work. I mean, I can talk to you about lawns and how silly they are in a dry environment. And yet, you can still have useful ones where you can play ball with a kid and kid can fall and not hurt themselves. That's a functional lawn. But I think more of the Southwest is going to go the way of Las Vegas, where they've banned non-functional turf. That's a lot of water. So those kinds of changes are ones I think we can get to faster, and then we need to help with the agricultural transition, which sometimes happens better through limitations on the amount of water people just have, either in surface water or groundwater. And groundwater is the big forcing element in California at the moment, but that's another story.
I just wanted to make one comment to the second question also. There's this question of urban versus agriculture in terms of how we prioritize, but also kind of near-term versus long-term. And I think there will be a tendency to try to find near-term solutions or to invest in things that get us water now, and there are reasons for that. I hope we will also balance that with a longer-term view of what does sustainability look like over the coming decades.
Great stuff. So we are running short on time, and I would just add my own editorial comment on the last question on priorities, that we welcome and accelerate the transition to the next generation of leaders as well. So it's great to hear questions from more students and engagement throughout this week and beyond in terms of accelerating that transition. We have time for a lightning round, really, of the 2 questions that I see in the back, brief responses, and then some parting shots. So that'll give us a sense of what to expect. Over to the back.
Yeah, I'm Dwayne Roth. I'm a 4th generation farmer from western Kansas, working with a lot of the food chains, big processors. We hear this carbon credit all over the world, here in the United States now. Should we be looking at maybe a water credit? Without no water, there's no carbon. And so should that credit be like an inset, instead of having nothing against United Airlines, but if they're going to buy a carbon credit, maybe who we're working with, where we're taking our commodity to, maybe we should be paid for conservation, paid for performance. So, I mean, do you ever see a water credit becoming just as talked about or popular as a carbon credit?
Thanks for the question. We'll hear the last question, then over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Luis Mabulo. I'm from the Philippines and I'm a social entrepreneur. I have a 2-part question, but I'll make it short. Is one kind of a follow-up to the question before, how can we transition existing funds, for example, climate finance and agricultural subsidies, into nature-based solutions and agricultural projects that are climate friendly? And how can we encourage that better? And the second part is, are biological and nature-based solutions enough to restore our ecosystems and our water sources, or do we need more technological solutions, like, for dare I say, being mildly controversial, SRM and solar radiation management? That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. So I think I'm going to turn to Tom first, because I know you're ready for the first question.
The both of them. Yeah, the first question, Dustin said my title, it includes the term water markets, and it's the idea of how do you provide a value or incentive for conserving water? How do you provide an incentive to the farmer? Dick talked a bit about some of the markets for water, and really that's for the water rights and transfers. I think the idea of a credit is even more appealing, or thinking about how do you incentivize it in its current use to create more efficiency. We have looked at different approaches to do that, and I think it would be a direction we would like to continue to explore. I think it's right that you need to think about, if you're looking at this transition to being more water efficient and sustainable over time, how do you reward or incentivize that practice? And a credit is a promising concept to do that.
Good. Over to the rest of the panel for either that question or the second one.
Because I'm going to hand off the mic, I'll just say my comment to the second one. I agree completely that nature-based solutions are not sufficient alone. And we think, obviously, the natural ecosystem is a fundamental part of this, but we're looking at combinations of solutions, including new technologies that can help to make these practices more sustainable over time.
Just a quick one. I think, again, thinking about water credits, it's hard to do it globally. I just had this conversation, just because water is different than climate. It's very localized, but there are all kinds of examples of people doing it. Some of the great work of TNC, think about, I like some of the programs where you use public dollars for ag efficiency and then split the difference between the farmer who gets the same, gets the benefit and the environment. That would be a better way to do it, to work it across, versus having those two be at cross purposes or always be at a regulatory phase. Maybe that's because I have the scars from doing it regulatorily in California. I prefer a combination of incentives and sharing. There's some creative examples in Australia and other places of doing that, and some real good examples in the water quality arena that are worth taking a look at, but again, at a local level. And I totally agree. I mean, nature-based solutions, I think, are a key element that takes a lot of work across divides, but you can add technology to it to make it work. And what we really need is better quantification and measurement, which is part of the problem with broad scales. We don't have all the data to show how much water is saved by doing either the forestry work, the meadow restoration, or the ag work. There's still it's within reach, but we need to do enough more to be able to justify either the public investments or certainly the private sector investments. But I think there's some really encouraging work going on by TNC as a matter of example in the Colorado Basin and elsewhere. So we can get there, but we need to do a little more work.
Just want to comment quickly on the question about efficiency in agriculture. There's been a big focus in Colorado on certainly the municipal side, and a lot's been done, not only in Colorado, but the West. The challenge on efficiency in agriculture, as we know, being in a prior appropriation state, many, if not most of our irrigation systems are water short, and there has been a lot of conversion to like sprinkler irrigation systems to make them more efficient. But oftentimes, if they're in a water short situation, that just makes more water available to their crop. It actually ends up depleting more water from the stream system, doesn't put more water back into the stream system. And so that's one of the challenges as we see looking at efficiency improvements. And Colorado also has a challenge in we have 9 interstate compacts. 2/3 of the water supply that's developed in our river systems goes to meet these downstream obligations. And we have an obligation, and one in particular on the Arkansas River Compact, that we can't improve above the conditions that were in there in 1948. And when we put in sprinkler systems, we've got to put water back into the system to keep it whole so we do not impact our sister states. So just some of the challenges we see when we're trying to do efficiency improvements.
Excellent. Well, we have run out of time. I'm feeling the eyes burning through me now with the 3-minute warning. So let me ask for a parting shot from the panel. Felicia introduced the Colorado River saying we need to look beyond or beneath the headlines. I forgot which one. I want you to write a new headline. So with the parting shot, recognizing that every place is unique. In fact, our fellow President FDR said in 1936 that there are no simple panaceas that can be applied to a drought problem in the whole of the drought area. So we know that local conditions matter. But with that in mind, what's the headline you'd want this audience to take away of what they can learn from the Colorado River? And I've now studied that Tom, he will look away from me when he doesn't want to answer first, but I'm going to go from my left all the way to Felicia at the end. So starting with you, Tom, then to Dick, then to Felicia.
Well, yeah, I meant to say at the beginning, we work in the Colorado River. The Nature Conservancy works in the Colorado River. We work in Nebraska on the Platte and Republican and the Ogallala aquifer issues. We work in California. We work in a lot of other places around the world that are facing these challenges of water scarcity and climate change and how to allocate a scarce resource. And so the headline, what would the headline be? Nature can contribute to sustainable water supply for food production and people.
Nice one.
Do you want an equal headline for that, Colorado River? It's a math problem.
Okay.
I'm an engineer. Inflow minus outflow equals change in storage. And
Well
we've
done.
seen what's happened with the inflow decreasing. It's had to come out of storage, but there's only so far you can go. So
We see
it's
some
a
future and
math
headline
problem.
writing for you.
Yep.
I like that. It's just a math problem.
It's just a math problem.
I want the headline to be "They rose to the occasion."
Okay. Let's rise to the occasion. Thanks to the panel.